Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, so the visible and the invisible, we are in the first chapter, the reflection and interrogation, and we're in the second and final part of the first subdivision, subchapter, which is the perceptual faith and its obscurity. And we'll finish up this section today. So in the last video we talked about the unjustifiable certitude of the world, the fact that even though we live in and we understand naturally, intuitively, if I can use that word without creating any problems, we understand the world as we live it. But when we try to explain it, that is to say, when we try and explicitly think it or talk about it, reduce it to terms and concepts, then we run into contradictions and paradoxes. And this is to do with the distinction between wholes and parts. The way we understand the world and reality when we grasp it as a whole, as we live it, as we experience it. But when we try and take that experience, which is in large part invisible, when we try and take that and turn it into something visible, something tangible, something we can grasp and manipulate and work with and understand conceptually, then we run into problems. And so Merleau-Ponty says we live the world, we understand it, but we can't explain it or think it. And this is just referring to the relation between the whole, the system itself, and the parts that make it up. And the way that you can't go from the latter to the former. You can't understand the whole by dissecting it and analysing the components. And the other thing that was important from the last video was the way I broke up our perception of the world into those three parts. Even though I've just said we can't do that, but this is a little bit different. The understanding the world, when we perceive the world, we see the world as it is, not as a representation or a copy. And yet we see the world for me. It's always for me. It's the world as I see it. And it's also the world for others, the world as it is for other people. So it's those three things combined into one. And in this video we're going to look at, basically we're going to spend the whole video looking at the scientific approach to the world and to reality. And then we'll spend a little bit at the end talking about the crisis, Merleau-Ponty's crisis. So the first part of the video, the scientific approach. So science tries to understand the world by defining truth as the objectivity, as that which can be measured, so in a quantifiable sense. And Merleau-Ponty asks, does this yield certainty? Does this give us a complete, clear picture? And the problem in general for Merleau-Ponty with this approach is that if we treat the world and define the true as that which can be measured, measurements necessarily exclude our contact with things. That is to say, they have no regard for the lived experience of the world. And there are three problems with this approach. The first is that experience is part of the world. Right? The fact that we experience is a part of the world, which therefore needs to be explained if we want to understand the world. So it's not going to be good enough to sweep subjective experience to the side and explain everything else and think you've explained the world, because you've just omitted half of it, right? The subjective experience of it. So that's the first problem with it. The second problem is that the world, as we've seen, the world is itself but it's also for me and it's also for others. So excluding experience essentially destroys the world. Experience is a fundamental part of the world. So you can't just get rid of it and think you are being, what you're left with is the pristine kind of real nature of the world, because you lose it. There is no world anymore. As we defined it in the first video, the world is itself, but it's for me, for others. You've got to have that. And third, even as the scientific approach excludes our contact with things, it presupposes it. It's built into the very nature of science as measurement, as observation. The experience, it's a part of it already. So it's something that's being presupposed and therefore overlooked in whatever conclusions the scientific approach reaches. So he looks at a few different specific examples of how the scientific approach works. He talks about physics first, and here he discusses the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics first, which is just the idea that particles aren't anywhere. They exist in that superposition of states, but observation collapses the wave function. And it's it's at that point that particles appear in specific locations, according to the probabilities, obviously. So even when science acknowledges this, it's forced to recognize this connection between the observer and the observed. That, in other words, determinations only have meaning for a certain situation of the observer, instead of causing a rethink of the whole subject-object dichotomy and model that we operate under. Science continues to think of the scientist, the observer, as an absolute mind detached from looking in on an object which is different from it. So even in the face of this very principle that emerges out of physics itself, the idea that the observer is a key part of the way the world is, it still clings to the idea that there's this fundamental distinction, subject and object, and that the former can observe the latter and from a detached perspective and not interfere with it. And when you do that, what you're getting is the unvarnished reality. Whereas, as quantum mechanics itself indicates, although no one knows exactly what quantum mechanics indicates yet, but as it's suggesting, Merleau-Ponty is saying, it says that the observer is a key part of this. Determinations only have meaning for a certain situation of the observer. I quite like that expression. Merleau-Ponty calls this way of thinking an objectivist ontology. So reducing things to objects. And I think he does, it's fair to say he does have in mind here like physical objects, material objects, and sensible objects. So the physical cause and effect, that's the model under which we tend to understand the world. But at the same time, objectivist ontology suggests there's a subject and an object, and the two are separate. So it's that cleavage between a subject on the one side and the object on the other, and this is pure and unvarnished. So he calls the scientist the absolute mind, an absolute mind completely detached from, independent of world as a separate reality, separate domain. So for Merleau-Ponty, the contact between the observer and the observed enter into the definition of the real, of the world. There's no dividing the two. And he ends up saying physics is either a method of acting in the world, so it's practical, but it tells us nothing about the world itself, or it starts with what there is, meaning that it must begin with the life world as the source. That is to say, the world as we experience it, the world as things themselves, as things for me, and as things for others. So starting with that lived experience. It's one or the other. You've got to choose one. And science takes the first, a method of acting in the world. But the consequence of that is that it doesn't tell us anything about the world itself. It gives us tools for manipulating and use the word interfering in reality, but I don't mean manipulate or interfere in a negative sense. It just gives us tools for controlling the world, but it doesn't tell us what the world is. It doesn't let us understand the world. The second discipline that Merleau-Ponty discusses is psychology. And here, psychology is subjective, but it treats the subjective like an object. So it thinks of, and this is how Merleau-Ponty says it, he says it thinks of the invisible of humans as a thing, as like a visible thing, as something it treats human beings and which are a whole, a system, something we can only grasp as a whole, but it breaks them up, and that's the invisible. There's nothing tangible, there's nothing sensible, material about that, but it treats those psychic states, our beliefs, our experiences of things, it treats those as things, discrete things, which have relations with other things, and and it imagines we can understand the whole, the invisible, by understanding the relations of all these visible parts. And again, so we're back to this. It's another example of objectivist ontology, even though we're dealing with the subjective. And this then, since it's an example of objectivist ontology, it assumes that human beings can be surveyed from a distance, can be understood from a third-person perspective. Whereas what's key for Merleau-Ponty is that the subjective can never be studied in this way. A psyche is what it is only when it's lived. The external view someone has of your psyche is not the same thing as you have from the inside. And more importantly, you can never get outside of your psyche to know it from the outside, from that third-person perspective. It's always that first-person lived experience which you have, and that's what a human being is. And that's what psychology attempts to study, but it does so through a third-person objectivist lens. So it's missing the very thing that it's intending to grasp, because it reduces the total, the whole, the system itself, the invisible of a human being, reduces it to parts, to separate, discrete, visible states which we can observe from a distance, and we can make rules to understand how those parts interrelate. And that is that objectivist ontology, and it leads us away from a proper understanding of human beings. So he says the psychologist tries to put themselves out of play to investigate the psyche, even as the physicist does the same to investigate the thing. This physics of the physicist and the psychology of the psychologist evince that henceforth, for science itself, the being object can no longer be being itself. Objective and subjective are recognized as two orders hastily constructed within a total experience, whose context must be restored in all clarity. So understand the unity of a total experience. That's what Merleau-Ponty is talking about. This total experience is the fundamental unit. Fracturing that totality, that unity in thought or in speech, using concepts, using the tools of language and thinking itself, which breaks things up into parts in order to understand it. It's the only way it works. Doing that ends up in contradiction. The experience itself is the fundamental unit, irreducible, and it's that which we understand as we live it. We understand it because we live it. But when we try to break it down, we end up treating that totality, that unity, as a collection of parts. And that is not the same thing. And this is the revision of our ontology that Merleau-Ponty's moving towards. It's being, but being grounded in experience, grounded in our actual lived perception. Perception is key. It's always been key for Merleau-Ponty. And this brings us back to experience and phenomenology. So being grounded in phenomenology, the being of the phenomenon. And then the other, another discipline, the third discipline that Merleau-Ponty looks at is Gestalt psychology. So here he says that the Gestalt psychology is an attempt to isolate structures of behavior which could then be investigated in an objective, precise fashion in the same way that the hard sciences proceed in order to yield the whole, in order to grasp the whole. And so this is, although Gestalt psychology and Gestalt philosophy there's a lot of good to be said about it, and I think there are some good insights made in that direction. And I haven't followed it through in any great detail. I'm no Gestalt expert, but it seems like what Merleau-Ponty's saying is that Gestalt psychology starts with the whole, which is the right way to go about it, but it ends up working backwards to find out how the parts interrelate in order to produce that whole. So it has one eye on the whole, and that's where it begins, which is correct, but it still works, it still tries to understand the whole from the parts. It tries to understand how the parts connect and relate in order to produce this whole. And Merleau-Ponty's whole thing is that those two, the whole and the parts, are completely qualitatively different. There is no getting from the parts to the whole. You start with the whole and you finish with the whole. Or you start with the parts and you finish with the parts, but you can't cross those, because if you do, you end up in paradoxes, you end up in contradictions, or you end up distorting the whole. So you get an explanation at the level of the parts, but the explanation ends up distorting the whole. You don't get a correct understanding of whatever it was you were originally trying to grasp. So that was the second problem that I have here. Let me run through both of them. The first problem with Gestalt psychology for Merleau-Ponty is that the relationships Gestalt psychologists identified tended to hold only in the artificial conditions of the lab. So they were good for when they performed their experiments, but they don't apply in the same way in the real world. You can say that about quite a bit of science, I think. The second problem is, this is what I said before, the parts and the whole are qualitatively different. And there's a nice quote for this. In the measure that we have to do with more integrated structures, we come to realize that the conditions account for the conditioned less than they are the occasion of its release. I really like that expression. The conditions account for the conditioned less than they are the occasion of its release. I didn't say that properly, did I? The conditions account for the conditioned less than they are the occasion of its release. So it's not about the condition, the parts producing. Sorry, it's not about the conditions, the parts producing the conditioned, the whole, so much as they are the way in which the whole manifests, the way in which the whole comes about. So the whole comes about through the parts, but the parts don't produce the whole. There's an asymmetrical relationship there. Like I said, the condition belongs to a different order. Think about the monocular versus binocular vision that we talked about in the last video. You don't get binocular vision just by combining two monocular images. It's a completely different kind of thing. And if you try and understand binocular vision through monocular vision, then it's just impossible, because they're two completely different kinds of thing, two completely different kinds of vision. So with regard to what we're talking about here with Gestalt psychology, the whole, the perceptual whole, is a different order from the parts that we try and understand. We try and understand it by the way that different things come into play in order to produce this whole. We try and break it down into things like shadows and lighting and the way objects appear in relation to other objects. We try and break it down into all of these separate, and we try and analyze it into all of these separate parts and understand the whole, the perceptual whole from those. But these are completely different orders. The whole of the perceptual experience can't be described objectively. It can't be understood. And this, I think it's fair to say that this is the invisible whole. The perceptual whole of experience is invisible in relation to the visible, sensible parts, through which we try and understand it. And Merleau-Ponty is just saying you can't get there. You can't understand that perceptual whole through a bottom-up procedure, even if you keep your attention on the whole, as Gestalt psychology and philosophy is famous for. Even though you keep your attention there to understand the parts, how they go to form it, it still won't work, because there's no way to go. There's no way to cross those different orders. And that's what Merleau-Ponty is talking about, a breakdown when we try to understand the whole at the level of the parts. And he talks about, a good example is he talks about the apparent width of a road in the distance. So we perceive the width of a road in the distance as constant, so the same as the width of the road close up, when viewed close up, despite the fact that there is a visible shrinking of perspective. So the visible fact is that the road in the distance is narrower than the road viewed from up close. Yet we perceive it as the same size. And this constancy arises, yes, as a result of a calculation in relation to other variables in the scene, but it can never be explained by them. Merleau-Ponty says, for the natural gaze, the road in the distance has no width that one could even ideally calculate. It's just the same width as the road viewed up close, because it's the same road. But it's also at the same time, it's not as wide, because there is a noticeable shrinking in perspective. But the perceptual truth only emerges when we grasp the close, the far off, and the horizon all as a system, when we grasp the whole thing as a totality, as a whole, and understand the relationships between those things within this totality. So starting with the totality and never leaving the totality, never trying to understand it from the parts up. So it makes no sense to even talk about the road in the distance in relation to the road up close and trying to understand some kind of conversion from one to the other. It has no meaning. As soon as you try and understand that, you've already gone astray. It's not that there's an explanation, we just haven't found it yet. It's that there is no explanation to be had there, because it's analysing something which can't be analysed. It's analysing something which is an organic whole. So the final discipline that Merleau-Ponty talks about is social psychology. So in social psychology, society as a whole is the object, and Merleau-Ponty says this is actually impossible to be, this discipline is impossible to approach from this objectivist ontology, because other people, as social and historical stimuli, lack physical existence. So we can't understand social psychology, we can't understand society as a whole in terms of sensible, objective measures. Other people don't act on us through immediately sensible properties, and this would be to treat them as visible physical things, discrete parts or objects. Rather, they act on us through social configuration, social space and time, a social code, and those kinds of things. And these are then invisible, in Merleau-Ponty's terms. And these make up what is the whole, the system itself. And so again, that visible-invisible distinction, we try and understand things as discrete, independent parts acting upon other things through sensible properties, but that's not the reality of it. And particularly for social psychology, which studies society as a whole, there is nothing to grasp in terms of parts when you try to understand society as a whole. You can break it down into individual people, but obviously that's a different thing from society itself. And that's Merleau-Ponty's point. Society itself can't be understood through an objectivist ontology, which breaking things down into parts and observing the physical, sensible relations between them. As an example of this, Merleau-Ponty talks about the way the West has ruled out magical effects, the effects of magic or myth. And that's a part of Western psychology. But if we want to understand society such as it is, as a whole, social psychology can't begin with this postulate, or it's presupposing its own conclusions. So if you try to understand society as a whole, starting with this idea that myth or magic have no effect, you're biasing your investigation from the start, because it means that you're looking for an understanding, but you've already ruled out other possibilities. And I don't think Merleau-Ponty is explicitly saying that magic is possible, and that it could be, the paranormal or anything like that. But the idea, and myth is a good way to think about this. Myth does have an effect on us in a society. It's a part of society. But our modern mindset discounts myth as a motivator or a cause for anything. So we interpret things which might seem as if they have a mythological component. We interpret them in purely objective terms. One example of this, I think, is the way that we can tend to see civilizations in the past, and their religions in particular, as attempts by them to understand physical phenomena, to understand the natural world. But that's thinking from a very modern mindset, right? That's what we do. We try and understand the physical world, and we have tools. Science has given us the tools to do that very objectively and precisely. And they didn't have those tools, but they were doing the same thing. They were engaged in the same project, trying to understand the world, and this was the best explanation they could come up with: gods and magical forces and those kinds of things. But that is overlaying our modern sensibilities onto people in the past, and it biases our conclusions. Maybe that wasn't really the primary objective. Maybe they weren't trying to understand the world the way that we try and understand the world today. But if we bring that mindset to it, then we don't get a proper understanding of their society. And Merleau-Ponty is saying actually the same thing, but just for our society. If we rule out the effects of this mindset, this way of thinking about the world as mythical, as magical, if we discount that as a possible, not as a real world thing. It's not that, again, I don't think Merleau-Ponty is saying magic is real, but we indulge in magical thinking. We indulge in mythical thinking. These things affect us, and they're a part of society. But if we begin by discounting all of that, we can't understand society properly. We get a distorted view again. If we break down the whole into parts, and in this case break it down in a biased fashion, then we don't get a proper accounting of the whole. One example that Merleau-Ponty does give about earlier societies is that he says, if we assume that they had a lived experience of time like ours, then we get a distorted view of their society. If we assume that they think the past doesn't exist because it's gone, the future doesn't exist because it hasn't happened yet, the only time that exists is now, the only time that fully is the present, then we can't understand their culture if they have a different view of time, if they see time in a different way. I remember hearing this. I'm not sure where. I'm not even sure if this was real. It might be I read it in a novel, but someone was talking about a culture where they see themselves. We see ourselves as walking forward into the future, facing what's yet to come. But in this, what I heard or what I read, they saw themselves as walking backwards into the future. And the reason was they don't know what's coming, but they know the past. So they're walking backwards because they have a clear view of what's happened, but the future is unknown. And that's a good example of this. If we start by thinking this is how everybody understands time, then we can't understand other cultures, or we distort what other cultures, other societies, how other societies might think. So finally, social psychology encounters philosophical questions like, what is another person? What is a historical event? Where is the historical event or the state? But seeing other people and history as objects or stimuli in that objectivist fashion means that it misses the very thing it's set out to study, which is that totality, the whole, the invisible that it's interested in understanding. Okay, so that's science. Let me turn to the second part of the video, which is the crisis. So Merleau-Ponty talks about the crisis situation of modern knowledge, and he traces it back to Cartesianism, which divided the world into two ideal factions: a physical world that is what it is in itself, and a psychism that is separate and self-contained. And that is where all of the problems start for Merleau-Ponty. When we operate with that model, then we have no chance of understanding the world. The only way to undo then these two idealizations is to return to Merleau-Ponty's perceptual faith, which gives us a real world that we experience and that is manifestly certain to us as we live it, and working from there, taking that as our starting point. And this is philosophy's task. It can't be science's task, because, as we've seen, science approaches the world in a very different way. It approaches the world in that Cartesian manner, with an absolute detached mind, viewing an external reality which is independent of it. And that cannot be an explanation or an understanding of world. In essence, science moves within and presupposes the world rather than questioning it. And it presupposes it as an independent thing in itself, separate from us. So this is quite a nice idea. Science takes itself out of the world, meaning that it then can't explain the world, or it can't even describe it, because it's removed a part of it. It's removed itself, and it is a part of the world. And this is the difference Merleau-Ponty sees with philosophy, because philosophy is the set of questions wherein he who questions is himself implicated by the question. So we're keeping ourselves a part of the world as we try and understand it. And that's the only way we can properly understand the world, because that's what the world is. Take that out and you actually take away the world. You investigate something else. You investigate an object that you've created out of the world, but you don't investigate the world itself. This is why experience is such a central part of the world for Merleau-Ponty, and it's why phenomenology is the only access point, because it's all about describing lived experience. So let's have a look at a summary. First up, we talked about the scientific approach, and the scientific approach defines truth as the objective, or that which can be measured. And the problem here is that this excludes our contact with the world. Therefore, it presupposes that contact. So it's not included in its explanation, which means it's not addressing the world, which is what we're really interested in here. It takes up an objectivist ontology, Merleau-Ponty calls it, and this is that subject-object distinction, that Cartesian distinction, but it's also one in which the object is a sensible part. It's something that it's essentially a physicalist or materialist approach. So it understands relations and interactions based on a sensible material outlook. And this is what Merleau-Ponty calls the visible. And it's opposed to Merleau-Ponty's ontology, which is grounded in experience. So the subject and the object together, not a subject confronting an object. And when you take that experience, that lived experience, which is the world, then you have, and that is what Merleau-Ponty calls the invisible. So just another way that those words have meaning for Merleau-Ponty in this first chapter. Finally, in the final analysis, science moves within and presupposes the world rather than questioning it. And it presupposes it as an independent, separate thing from us. And something which it is not a part of. It excludes itself from the world and then tries to understand it. And that distorts the picture. The four scientific disciplines we looked at were physics, psychology, Gestalt psychology, and social psychology. And we just broke those down in the way that none of them get to a proper understanding of the world. Then the final section was the crisis, and here Merleau-Ponty notes there's a crisis situation of modern knowledge, and this is based on Descartes and his division, his strict subject-object, mind-matter division. Merleau-Ponty says we must undo the idealizations of world as an object and mind as a subject by returning to perceptual faith, by starting from that lived experience, which is within all of its certitude, in all of its unquestionable reality. And this returning to perceptual faith involves a questioning in which he who questions is implicated by the question. So it's a questioning that includes the questioner. And this is the job of philosophy, not science, for all of the reasons that we looked at. And that's the end of today's video. Nothing more to say. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.